11:30 p.m. Eastern Time, July 18th. That's the exact minute the Pentagon confirmed the B-2 Spirit was back in Iranian airspace. And this time, it wasn't hitting a nuclear site. It was hunting something buried so deep that almost nothing else in the American arsenal can touch it. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because what these bombers just did rewrites the entire shape of this war. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the world's most expensive aircraft just flew halfway around the planet for a single night's work. Here's the headline first. Plain and simple. U.S. Central Command confirmed that on the night of July 18th, American forces completed their 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, and this round carried a different signature than the previous 7. According to CENTCOM's official public release, the strikes hit Iranian coastal surveillance and air defense facilities, maritime capability sites, and missile and drone storage locations. And for the first time, the statement explicitly named the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the target of retaliatory action. That's not a small detail. That's the Pentagon telling you, in writing, that this stopped being about degrading equipment and became about punishing the organization that ordered the last attack. Now here's why that attack happened in the first place. And this is the part that should make your stomach turn a little. 2 American service members were killed in action at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan on July 17th during an Iranian ballistic missile and drone barrage. A 3rd remains missing. That brings the total number of American service members lost in this conflict to 16. President Trump, speaking to reporters, called their deaths the ultimate sacrifice. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said the loss only stiffened American resolve. And within about 18 hours, the retaliation was already in the air. That's not a slow bureaucratic response. That's a military machine that had already preloaded its options and just needed the order. But keep watching, because the story isn't really about missile counts or press releases. It's about which aircraft the Pentagon reached for when it decided to make a point. And this time, multiple defense outlets tracking open-source flight data confirmed the B-2 Spirit was airborne again. This is only the second time this specific bomber has been used against Iran in the current campaign. And to understand why that matters, you have to go back 13 months to the night that started all of this. June 2025. Operation Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri on a mission that would stretch more than 30 hours in the air. Their target, Iran's 3 principal nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each one weighing 30,000 pounds, were dropped that night, according to reporting from The Hill. That single mission is what President Trump later called, at the Board of Peace's inaugural meeting, a magnificent operation that helped bring calm to a region that hadn't seen it in generations. I won't pretend that's a neutral description. That's the president's own characterization, but the operational facts behind it are well documented and independently verified by multiple outlets tracking the flight paths in real time. So when the B-2 shows back up more than a year later, hitting what CENTCOM described as hardened ballistic missile sites using 2,000-pound penetrator munitions this time instead of the 30,000-pound bunker busters, that's a message all by itself. You don't send the most expensive, most heavily protected aircraft program in American history unless the target genuinely requires it. Let me explain exactly what that aircraft can do, because once you understand its numbers, you'll understand why Iran has no real answer for it. The B-2 Spirit can fly above 50,000 feet. It has a range of roughly 6,000 nautical miles without refueling, and with aerial tankers supporting it, it can reach essentially anywhere on the planet and fly home. Its radar cross-section is famously described as roughly the size of a small bird, achieved through a combination of composite skin, radar-absorbent coating, and a flying wing shape that gives Iranian search radar almost nothing to lock onto. It can carry up to 40,000 pounds of ordnance internally, which matters because internal carriage is what preserves the stealth profile in the first place. Strap weapons to the outside of most aircraft, and you've just handed the enemy a reflective surface. The B-2 doesn't have that problem because everything it drops comes from inside the airframe, invisible until the moment it separates. Now here's the piece that actually explains the entire Jordan retaliation. According to Fox News, reporting sourced to senior defense officials, this was not the B-2's first quiet appearance since Midnight Hammer. Back in April, when a U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over Iran, and its crew went into a recovery operation behind enemy lines, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper reportedly ordered B-2s to fly round-trip from Whiteman straight into Iranian airspace to strike an underground Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters facility near Tehran, using the same massive ordnance penetrator design from Midnight Hammer. Sources told Fox News the target received time-sensitive intelligence pointing to a large concentration of IRGC commanders inside that bunker, and the facility was reported destroyed. A senior military source summed up the mission in 4 words: "We delivered the heat." That's one of the only direct quotes I'm going to give you today, because I want you hearing it exactly the way it was reported. not paraphrased into something it wasn't. Let's slow down on that April mission for a second, because I don't think it's gotten nearly enough attention, and it's genuinely one of the more remarkable things that's happened in this entire war. An American F-15E Strike Eagle went down over Iranian territory, which means 2 crew members were suddenly on the ground behind enemy lines in the middle of an active war zone, the exact scenario every combat aviator trains for and prays they never have to live through. While that rescue operation was unfolding in real time, with all the chaos and risk that comes from trying to extract 2 Americans out of hostile territory, the CENTCOM commander made the call to simultaneously send B-2s against an IRGC headquarters bunker near Tehran, timed specifically to keep Iranian forces suppressed and disoriented while the recovery team worked. According to a senior defense official who spoke with Fox News, B-1 Lancers, sometimes called bones by the crews who fly them, dropped roughly 100 2,000-pound bombs during that same window just to keep Iranian personnel away from the rescue site. CENTCOM's own press release confirmed both American service members were recovered successfully. Think about the level of coordination that requires. Stealth bombers hitting a leadership bunker, conventional bombers suppressing the immediate area, and a rescue team on the ground, all happening at once, all synchronized down to the minute. That's not something you improvise. That's the product of a command structure that had already war-gamed exactly this scenario long before it happened for real. So by the time July 18th rolled around, this wasn't the B-2's second rodeo. It was closer to its 3rd confirmed combat appearance in just over a year, and each time, the target set has gotten more specific and more personal. Midnight Hammer was about nuclear infrastructure. April was about decapitating command and control during an active rescue. July was about ballistic missile storage, in direct response to American blood being spilled in Jordan. You can see the pattern forming, and it should worry anyone still running Iran's air defense network, because the trend line only points toward deeper, more targeted strikes. Now let's slow down for a second on the actual weapon itself, because I think most coverage glosses over just how purpose-built this thing is, and once you understand it, the whole strategy clicks into place. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator isn't a bigger version of a normal bomb, it's a completely different category of weapon. At 30,000 pounds, it's built with a hardened steel casing specifically designed to survive the shock of punching through dozens of feet of rock and reinforced concrete before its fuse even triggers. Most bombs detonate on impact or shortly after. The AMOP is engineered to keep driving downward, absorbing that punishment, and only go off once it's already inside the structure it's targeting. That's the difference between cratering the roof of a bunker and actually destroying what's inside it. Only the B-2 can carry it in meaningful numbers while remaining stealthy, because the weapon is simply too large and too heavy for most other aircraft in the American inventory to deliver without giving up either range or radar signature. And here's the part that should really make you pause. Every one of these missions, Midnight Hammer, the April Rescue Strike, and this latest round on the 18th, started from the exact same runway in the middle of Missouri. Whiteman Air Force Base isn't near any ocean, isn't near any regional ally, isn't within 1,000 miles of the Persian Gulf, and it doesn't need to be. That's the entire point of the platform. Iran can build all the underground missile cities it wants. It can harden every mountain in the Zagros range, but it cannot threaten the launch point of the weapon that keeps finding those mountains, because that launch point sits inside the continental United States, protected by geography that no missile in Iran's current arsenal can reach. Keep that in your head as we go through the specific sites, because it changes the entire calculus of deterrence. Let's talk about where those missiles were actually stored, because this is where independent satellite analysis gets genuinely fascinating. CENTCOM did not publicly name the exact facility struck on July 18th, and I want to be upfront about that, because I'm not going to pretend a location is confirmed, when it isn't. But defense analysts at Army Recognition, cross-referencing satellite imagery with research published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, point to a network of underground missile complexes Iran has built into mountainous terrain across the western half of the country, sites the CSIS research identifies in areas including Khorramabad, Tabriz, and Kermanshah. These are not simple storage sheds. This is what analysts call missile city architecture, and one specific location keeps coming up in the open source community. The Konesh Canyon complex outside Kermanshah, which satellite imagery reviewed by maritime executives shows, contains at least 60 separate tunnel bunkers cut into the canyon walls. 60 tunnel entrances. Let that number sit with you for a second, because that's not a single vulnerable target. That's an entire underground city built specifically to survive exactly the kind of campaign the United States is currently running. Each tunnel is engineered so mobile launcher vehicles, the transporter erector launchers that carry, raise, and fire the missiles, can be driven out, armed, and launched within minutes, then driven straight back into the mountain before a counterstrike can even be planned. Kermanshah wasn't chosen by accident. It sits close enough to the western border to threaten regional targets quickly. And it's dug into terrain that was specifically selected. because conventional airstrikes historically couldn't reach deep enough to matter. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for the regime, though. That kind of tunnel architecture was designed to survive normal precision bombs. It was not designed with a massive ordnance penetrator in mind, a weapon purpose-built to punch through layered rock and reinforced concrete before detonating at depth instead of on the surface. When you combine that weapon with an aircraft that can approach essentially undetected, the 60 tunnels at Kermanshah stop looking like an impenetrable fortress and start looking like 60 individually numbered problems for the IRGC's aerospace force. But don't think Kermanshah is the only underground network absorbing punishment right now, because there's a second site that tells an even stranger story. And it's the one that shows you just how resilient Iran has actually built these things. South of Isfahan sits the Sofe Mountain Missile Complex, and according to defense reporting from Defense Security Asia, this location has been repeatedly struck by both B-2 Spirit and B-52 Stratofortress bombers throughout the broader campaign, with penetrator munitions targeting entrances, storage chambers, and the tunnel corridors connecting them. One resident living near Isfahan described watching the mountain get bombed almost every single night, watching the smoke rise, and then waking up to see missiles launching from those exact same mountains hours later. That's not propaganda from either side. That's a first-hand account of a resilience that open-source intelligence assessments say allowed the complex to resume limited launch activity within roughly 12 hours of even the heaviest bombardment cycles. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it changes how you should think about this entire campaign. This isn't a war being won in a single decisive strike, the way people online like to imagine it. Isfahan keeps absorbing hits and keeps functioning, at least partially, which tells you Iran built genuine redundancy into these facilities. Multiple entrances, compartmentalized storage, backup routes to the surface. Destroying a target like Sofe Mountain isn't a single mission. It's a campaign of attrition, night after night, tunnel after tunnel, and that's exactly the kind of fight the B-2 was purpose-built to sustain, because it doesn't need forward basing in the region at all. It flies from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, refuels in the air, strikes, and flies home, all without ever touching soil closer than the continental United States. Now, stay with me here, because the political layer underneath all of this matters just as much as the bombs themselves. Trump's own comments about the June 2025 campaign set the tone for everything that's followed. At the Board of Peace's inaugural meeting in February, he called the B-2 bombers magnificent and credited them with helping deliver what he described as the first real peace the Middle East had seen in 3,000 years. Whether you agree with that framing or not, it tells you how central this specific aircraft has become to the administration's public narrative around the entire war. Every time the B-2 flies, it isn't just a tactical decision. It's a political statement broadcast straight to Tehran and straight to the American public at the same time. And Tehran has responded exactly the way you'd expect a cornered regime to respond, with a mix of defiance and quiet desperation. Iran's leadership has repeatedly vowed that a significant portion of its military capability remains unused, that any continued American pressure will trigger a response beyond what Washington expects. Iran's army spokesman said as much publicly, but here's the problem with that rhetoric, and it's a problem of their own making. Every night the B-2s and their supporting aircraft fly, they are specifically targeting the exact infrastructure that would let Iran deliver on that threat, the missile storage, the command centers, the coordination nodes. You can't credibly threaten an escalation you no longer have the connected infrastructure to execute. It's the military equivalent of promising to make a phone call after someone's already cut the line. Before we go further, I need to give you the piece that actually explains how a B-2 survives a mission like this in the first place, because the bomber never flies alone. According to CBS News, reporting drawn directly from the 509th Bomb Wing at Whiteman, stealth F-22 and F-35 fighters escorted the B-2s into Iranian airspace during the original Midnight Hammer mission, clearing the path and standing ready to defend the bombers if Iranian air defenses somehow got a track. Behind the scenes, ground crews were working just as hard. Chief Master Sergeant Frank Espinoza, who led the team loading the massive ordnance penetrators onto the aircraft, told CBS News that his team made it happen flawlessly. That's the unglamorous half of the story. The maintainers and weapons loaders who spend hours in the Missouri heat making sure 30,000-pound bombs are seated and armed correctly before a jet even leaves the ground, and none of what follows happens without them getting it exactly right. Stay with me, because the political fallout back home is just as important as anything happening over Iranian airspace. Congress has been anything but unified on this. The Hill reported that support for the Iran war among the president's own base has been slipping in recent polling, even as the House narrowly passed its annual defense policy bill with a handful of Democrats crossing the aisle to support it. That's a fractured coalition trying to fund a war that keeps escalating faster than public opinion can settle on how it feels about it. And it's not just Capitol Hill feeling the pressure. The State Department issued a worldwide caution alert to American citizens abroad. the first alert of that scale since the opening weeks of the conflict, which tells you the risk calculus for ordinary Americans traveling internationally has shifted in a way it hadn't since this whole thing started. Now, here's a thread you need to watch closely because it shows how fast this war can reach places that have nothing to do with either side's actual grievance. On July 16th, just 2 days before the B-2s returned, a drone struck an oil tanker at Iraq's Basra export terminal, according to multiple Reuters sources cited by Arab News and Bloomberg. Iraqi officials briefly suspended crude loading as a precaution before confirming operations were continuing close to normal. And the head of Iraq's state oil marketer said publicly, the tanker wasn't even the intended target of whoever launched that drone. Nobody has officially claimed responsibility, but Basra handles a massive share of Iraq's export capacity. And combined with ongoing disruption through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that, according to independent tracking accounts for roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply, you start to see how a war that began over nuclear enrichment and ballistic missiles has turned into something with the power to move fuel prices on the other side of the planet. Let's talk about the human cost here too, because I'm not going to gloss past it the way some coverage does. 16 American service members have now died in this conflict. Real people with real families receiving folded flags. Iranian casualty figures reported by outlets including Iran's own Red Crescent and independently by groups like Hengal run into the hundreds, with reporting on strikes near population centers drawing scrutiny from human rights monitors. War reporting on both sides of this conflict deserves skepticism. Figures get inflated, figures get suppressed, and I'd encourage you to read multiple outlets rather than take any single number as gospel, especially early in a news cycle before independent verification is caught up with the initial claims. But the underlying reality doesn't change based on which number you trust most. This is a real war with real casualties on both sides, and no amount of impressive stealth technology changes that fact. So where does this actually leave the campaign, strategically speaking? I want to walk you through what analysts are calling the 30,000-foot view, because the individual strikes only make sense once you connect them. Iran built its entire deterrence strategy around the assumption that its missile infrastructure was too deep, too dispersed, and too well defended to be systematically dismantled from the air. That assumption held up reasonably well against conventional airstrikes and even against most cruise missile packages. It has not held up against the specific combination the United States has now demonstrated 3 separate times: stealth penetration paired with a purpose-built bunker-defeating weapon launched from a base nobody in the region can threaten because it's sitting in the middle of Missouri. That combination is also reshaping how other countries think about their own military planning. And this is genuinely one of the more surprising ripple effects of the entire campaign. According to reporting from National Security Journal, Chinese military strategists have reportedly been closely studying the effectiveness of sustained stealth bomber campaigns against hardened, dispersed targets, and the operational lessons from this specific conflict are said to be influencing procurement priorities around Beijing's own H-20 and JH-XX stealth programs. For years, Chinese doctrine leaned heavily on missile-based deterrence and drone saturation. What they're reportedly watching now is a demonstration that even the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems struggle against a sustained multi-axis stealth penetration campaign, and that reusable stealth platforms can apply pressure night after night in a way that a single missile salvo simply cannot replicate. When your adversary's air campaign becomes a case study for a completely different country's weapons program on the other side of the world, that tells you exactly how significant these missions actually are. Here's another detail worth pausing on, because it explains why the B-2 specifically, and not some other platform, keeps getting the call for these missions. The aircraft entered service in the 1990s and has been continuously modernized ever since, to the point that defense analysts note the only truly original component left on a current generation B-2 is essentially the airframe itself. Everything else has been rebuilt, upgraded, or replaced multiple times over. That matters because it means the Pentagon isn't relying on outdated technology dressed up in an old shell. It's relying on a genuinely current weapon system that happens to share a 50-year design lineage. 19 or 20 of these aircraft are based at Whiteman under the 509th Bomb Wing, and every single mission against Iran so far has originated from that one wing, flown by the same tight community of crews who trained specifically for exactly this kind of long-duration, high-stakes penetration mission. Now let's bring this back to what's actually happening on the ground inside Iran right now, because the economic and infrastructure picture is deteriorating fast. Multiple reports indicate Iran's energy ministry has issued emergency directives urging citizens to ration electricity and air conditioning as the national power grid strains under sustained attacks on energy infrastructure. Transportation corridors connecting Iran to Russia and China through rail lines have been repeatedly struck. Oil export terminals have faced disruption. This is the second and third order effect of a bombing campaign that isn't just targeting missiles anymore, it's targeting the connective tissue that lets the regime function as a state at all. And Tehran has responded to that pressure with warnings of catastrophic retaliatory strikes against regional infrastructure if the campaign against its domestic grid continues, specifically naming the UAE and Kuwait as potential targets. Whether that threat is credible or just another example of rhetoric outpacing capability is something we'll find out in the coming nights. And I genuinely don't think anyone, including people inside the Pentagon, knows the answer with certainty right now. I also want to take a moment to explain why I keep naming where every single one of these details comes from. Because in a story moving this fast, with this much riding on it, sourcing is the whole game. CENTCOM's own public releases give you the official record, the dates, the target categories, the operational language the Pentagon chooses to use. Outlets like The Hill, Fox News, CBS News, and OAN give you the reporting layer built on top of that. The sourcing from officials willing to add detail the official releases leave out. And organizations like Army Recognition, Maritime Executive, and Defense Security Asia give you the independent analytical layer, the satellite imagery review, and the open source cross-referencing that lets you sanity check what's being claimed against what can actually be observed from space. When all three of those layers line up, you can trust the picture they're painting. When they don't, that's exactly where the caveats and the uncertainty belong. And I've tried to flag those moments honestly rather than smoothing them over for the sake of a cleaner story. Let's also address something that's been circulating in defense circles, because it's worth being precise about rather than letting speculation run wild. Some of the imagery released alongside these missions has shown unusual markings near the leading edges of the B-2's wings, small white rectangles that defense outlet The War Zone flagged as unusual for a combat mission. The reporting was careful not to jump to conclusions, noting these could relate to radar signature testing, sealing methods, or something entirely mundane. And that outlet explicitly said the purpose remains unconfirmed. I'm mentioning it because I think it's a good example of how to handle uncertain details responsibly. You report what's visible, you report what experts speculate it might mean, and you're honest when nobody actually knows for sure. That's the standard I'm holding this entire breakdown to. And it's why I keep pointing you toward the actual sources instead of just asserting things with false confidence. So here's where all of this actually leaves us, heading into whatever comes next in this campaign. CENTCOM has now completed strikes for 12 consecutive nights as of July the 22nd, based on their own official releases, meaning the tempo hasn't slowed down since the B-2's returned to the fight. The IRGC has been explicitly named as a target rather than a background actor. American casualties have climbed to 16, and that number alone guarantees this campaign isn't winding down out of political fatigue anytime soon. Iran's underground missile network, the kind built into mountains outside Kermanshah and Isfahan, has proven durable but not invulnerable, absorbing repeated strikes while still showing real degradation over time. And the B-2, an aircraft that first flew before most of the IRGC's current leadership was even born, keeps getting the call every single time the mission genuinely requires something no other platform in the world can deliver. What happens over the next few weeks probably depends less on the hardware and more on decisions being made in rooms we don't have access to, in Washington, and in whatever remains of Iran's command structure after months of this pressure. But if the pattern from Midnight Hammer through the April rescue mission through this latest strike on the 18th tells us anything, it's that every time Iran escalates, the responses come back heavier, more precise, and more specifically aimed at the exact capability that made the escalation possible in the first place. That's not a guess. That's the documented pattern across 3 separate confirmed missions over 13 months. And it's worth watching closely because the next chapter of this is going to write itself in real time, probably within the next few nights, based on how this current tempo has held so far. One more angle worth understanding before we wrap this up, because it explains why Iran hasn't simply backed down despite 13 months of this pressure. Regional analysts keep pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. The regime's survival calculation isn't built around protecting its population, it's built around protecting the command structure itself, and that changes what counts as an acceptable loss from Tehran's perspective. A missile city outside Kermanshah losing a handful of tunnels is a cost the leadership can absorb. A direct strike on the command bunkers where that leadership actually sits is the one outcome the regime has spent enormous resources trying to prevent, which is exactly why the April strike on that underground IRGC headquarters near Tehran mattered so much more than its size might suggest. It signaled that the sanctuary the leadership assumed it had, hundreds of feet of rock between them and anything the United States could deliver, was never as absolute as they believed. That's also why you're seeing Iran lean so heavily on its remaining proxy network and its rhetoric toward neighboring states, rather than direct confrontation with American air power. Threatening Kuwait, threatening the UAE, warning about catastrophic retaliation against regional infrastructure. All of that is a lot easier to say than to actually execute once your ballistic missile storage, your command centers, and your coordination network are being systematically dismantled one underground facility at a time. Words are the cheapest weapon left in an arsenal that keeps losing its expensive ones. And I think that's the lens you should be watching the next few weeks through. Listen less to what Tehran says it's capable of, and watch instead what infrastructure is actually still standing after each strike. Because that gap between rhetoric and remaining capability is only going to widen the longer this campaign continues at its current pace. I'd genuinely like to know what you think happens next. Do you think Kermanshah's missile city gets systematically dismantled the way Isfahan has been ground down over these past months? Or does Iran's underground redundancy hold long enough to outlast the political will in Washington to keep flying these missions? Drop your read on it in the comments, because I've seen some genuinely sharp analysis from this audience on past breakdowns, and I want to hear where you land on this one. Thanks for sticking with me through the full picture today instead of just the highlight reel, and I'll see you in the next one.